I want to talk about where the bank has moved on this issue in the last few years since the World Development Report. I'll say something about the kinds of innovation that we're trying to develop, new kinds of outcome measures in particular. Then I'll say something about where I think the field in general could usefully move in the future. Before I do, though, it occurred to me that I didn't answer a question from earlier about the growth mindset from Peru to Indonesia. There was a question about context and diagnosis, and I should point out that before we did the Indonesia growth mindset, we did a lot of work in Indonesia too, and then also in South Africa, to actually see whether there's room for movement in growth mindset, to see whether the measures actually work there. So I think that was a good question to say you just can't pick up something from one place, put it in new context without doing initial diagnosis, and we were very aware of that and we're involved in that. Okay, so since the World Development Report, we have set up a team in the World Bank. We call ourselves Embed. We have 10 people full-time, a number of other partners, ambassadors, another 10, 15 people in various ways, work with us, and then a bunch of people now interested in the topic around the institution. We were involved in about 90 projects. We have results from about 26 in the last 2 years, working in 50-plus countries and across most sectors. Most of our work is with World Bank project teams. We are in dialogue to work directly with governments. There are, as I mentioned, 130 units around public bodies around the world that have set up behavioral science teams or nudge teams, whatever you want to call them. And in some cases, we're providing direct institutional support, capacity building to those units. And the way that usually works is really learning by doing. I think we don't quite have, like if you're studying Microeconomics 101, there's a textbook. If you want to calculate elasticity, we can tell you how to do that. If we're going to tell you how to nudge, because context is so important, I think honestly it's still a little bit of an art or a craft. It's not quite a science, right? The evaluation is a science, I think, but choosing in a given context, if you want to get kids to school, should you use a social norm? Should you sort of simplify the enrollment procedure? Should you change the mental model of what a girl can do? Any of those things could work. It's a little bit of an art still, knowing how to do the diagnosis and figuring out where to push. And so learning by doing is very important. So then when we engage with a project team or with a government, what we typically do is we'll have a workshop, sort of talk through the issues. Here's the principles, but then we'll think, okay, let's pick a project. Let's pick a challenge, and learning by doing, then go through the steps of diagnosis, designing an intervention, doing the evaluation, and thinking about adaptation. So that's typically the process that we think is important at this phase of the life cycle of what's still a relatively new field, I think. So we do most of our time is that work. I'll say a couple words about innovation. I think one of the things that behavioral science is bringing to the field is new outcome measures. We're measuring, mindsets are an outcome measure now too. And so we're developing techniques in a whole host of areas. One is measuring social norms. Right now we have a survey in the field in Jordan, which is sort of part of a long diagnosis where we're trying to measure women's labor force participation and the social norms around that. In Jordan, has the lowest women's labor force participation in the region, only 14%. For men, it's about, I think, 65 or so, even though women are more educated than men now in Jordan. It's kind of incredible. It makes you wonder why people are educating their girls, sort of what's that about? So we're trying to measure social norms, right? Sort of we're trying to measure what the respondent does and believes, what he or she thinks other people do, what he or she thinks other people think she should do, and then what she thinks her partner should do. So there's an intra-household bargaining story here too. We're trying to measure this. One of the things we discovered is that norms really consist of packages, right? So there's not just a norm that a woman or a girl should do X, but there's a certain norm around being an appropriate mother. So a certain kind of norm around being home in time to cook dinner. There's another norm about being visible in public, and so these are different kinds of aspects of the gender norm. And so we're trying to measure empirical, normative, and intra-household expectations on each of these different packages. So we're doing that, and we think eventually, if it works, will be broadly applicable to measure social norms about corruption, in a variety of areas too. So that's one area of innovation. Related to that, we're trying to sort of use narratives. We'll also record, in the Jordan context, why people do what they, well, one of the questions is, are you a typical Jordanian woman, yes or no? And then we'll record. And then we're going to use, content analysis to measure those narratives. That's another kind of innovation. And the early pilot data suggests that women are refusing to answer the narrative at 50% of the time. So the norm is getting in the way of our measurement too. So we're trying to work on that. Another thing is measuring socio-emotional skills. The World Bank is a step, and we're trying to improve the measurement of that because some of the social skills and cognitive skills are not unrelated. We're trying to improve that. Measurements of grit. Grit is passion plus persistence. Angela Duckworth, psychologist, has developed this. We've developed a way to sort of adapt it to Macedonia and measure it more carefully. I mentioned growth mindset, cognitive behavioral therapy. We're trying to develop apps for community health workers. Trying to measure cosmopolitanism, how global is your outlook. We're working with some psychologists to try and measure a scale for that. Gender bias, there's something called an implicit association test. And this is a test in which it measures your unconscious bias. The way it works is that you have some words, you have sort of like pairs of words, say man, work, woman, home. And and then some other words like, boss. You've got to sort that to the work side. Or if it's like, pants, you work that to the man side. And then you switch, and then if it's like, cooking and kids, you sort it to the women's side or the home side. Then you switch it and have man, home, women, work, and then you have to sort something like pants and saris, say, and you've got to sort them. And the cognitive dissonance slows down your sorting speed. And this is a measure of your unconscious bias. So this has been developed by Mazin Banerjee at Harvard. We've sort of doing it in Turkey and again Macedonia to sort of measure whether this gets in the way of gender bias in hiring and job seeking decisions. List experiments are something that's been developed to sort of measure things you don't want to tell the truth about. You sort of have a list of items and say which one do you disagree with, and at a population level you can see where people aren't necessarily telling the truth. Cultural content modeling is something that anthropologists have developed to try and get at your causal story, and so one of our projects is about, in the Philippines, it's a very high level of stunting. What's that about? Lots of things, but one of them may be that people in the Philippines might think that Filipinos are just short by nature. It's just, it's just the way it is. It has nothing to do with nutrition. So we're actually measuring this in a population of healthcare workers, of parents, and in politicians. But to get at this, we need to sort of first get at the causal story people have. And so we're going to ask people, even before we do a focus group, to sort of write down their own causal story, and then only begin to get them to talk about it, because we're trying to get at the unconscious, the unconscious story, and we'll sort of aggregate it in a way that people have done. So that's innovation and measurement that I think is, there's a long way to go. We're with we have lots of partners around the world. We have a long way to go in improving these measurements to get at cognitive measures, which I think are very important. Now, behavioral science, behavioral economics, and nudging, one of the criticisms is that, okay, fine, so you get, a few more people to pay their taxes, but you still have high levels of corruption, or, they pay their taxes and where's the money going? That's another problem. So you're really only doing things at the margins. This is sort of one of the criticisms that, it's not like improving governance, what you really need to do. And this is, one of the criticisms we commonly get. And I think, it's reasonable. Among the responses are, one, well, tell me how you're going to improve governance. So there's that response. Another one is that I think that we can actually use behavioral science techniques to test laws and regulations before they're rolled out. In the same way that we do product safety tests, right? A new car, a new phone, you want to test it before it's rolled out. You can actually, if there's a new regulation, I think we can test it in the lab or a lab in the field before it's rolled out. And I think this is where I would like our team to go. For instance, in a financial regulation space, one of the proposals that's out there is, disclosure. When you're getting sort of a financial advisor or a bank talks to you, that person should disclose any conflicts of interest, right? And so a lot of regulations say this is useful. Well, there's some lab evidence that suggests actually this makes things worse, because when an advisor feels that he or she has disclosed their conflict of interest, then they feel free to really exploit you. So we could actually, in different contexts, sort of test in the lab whether we think a rule like this would make sense, whether it would promote fiduciary behavior or not, truth-telling or not, in a lab. And then before we rolled out this product, we could test it. Similarly, there's things about privacy, about risk, and one of the standard techniques to improve compliance on the part of firms as well as individuals. The tax example is compliance on the part of individuals, but firms also have to exhibit a variety of modes of compliance about occupational health and safety standards, on licensing, all kinds of things. And the standard approach is we're going to audit you, we're going to come find you and fine you, if it doesn't work. Well, maybe that's true, but we know from behavioral economics that people don't understand probabilities. A 1 in 10,000 risk of an audit is basically the same as a 1 in a million or 1 in 10 million risk of. People can't tell the difference. So we can, in the lab, think about risk and how we should present audit risk, whether how clear we should make it, how we should define it, whether other ways to do it before something like that is rolled out. So that's a proposal that we're moving towards, is sort of how to think about rules and regulations and use behavioral science to sort of test them before they're rolled out. And that helps us get at this criticism that we're just doing smaller things at the margins, because it gets at some of the big governance questions that are out there, and I think we can make a difference in those as well.